Hello and welcome to another Wainrider Wednesday, the weekly series where we look at progress on the upcoming mod for Rome Total War Alexander, Total War Wainriders. This is a mod set in the Third Age of Middle-earth before the War of the Ring, when the Wainriders of the East were assaulting Gondor, and there was lots of other stuff happening too. And today we're going to be looking sort of at the northwestern part of the map as we focus in on the High Elves. This is a faction that is a composite of several different enclaves, several different areas of elven settlement, but what they all have in common is some high elven lineage, some tie back to the elves of previous ages. In distinction to the Avari, which we looked at earlier, who are settled in these just a couple of settlements in the east near the Sea of Rune, and the Woodland Realm, Thranduil's territory, which is again just a tiny hidden area, just two settlements in the northwest of Mirkwood. The High Elves have actually a lot of territory, spanning a fairly broad region of Middle-earth, and they have some very strong units, a very good melee lineup with a lot of variety, it has to be said. They've got cav, they've got bows, they've got a bit of it all. As a reminder, this preview is going to focus on the campaign side of things. There has already been a series of videos looking at each faction's unit roster. You can find those on the channel as well. Now, of course, there was no faction called the High Elves during this period, and the territories that comprise the High Elves, the Lindon area, Rivendell, and the Lorien region, they were not politically united into a single territory. However, for the purposes of gameplay, we have united them for this mod, and there is some reasoning to back that up. We do hear, for example, that during some of the wars with Angmar, Rivendell, being under siege, was relieved by help from Lorien. We also know, of course, that Elrond had ties to Círdan in the west. Elrond was sort of a liege of Gil-galad, I believe, way back in the earlier Second Age. And there's no reason to suppose why that sort of tie, that kind of relationship, would not have held in the Third. We do know that elves in the Lindon area were helpful to the Kingdom of Arthedain, or Arnor, at various points in its history, and so all of these three elven enclaves seem to have similar aims, all of them helping the North Kingdom at various points and supporting each other through the history. So it seems to make sense to think of them as some kind of league for the purposes of the mod. So to tie this all together, let's take a look at the faction preview that I've written up on the faction selection screen here, just to give us some sense of background and lore, and then we'll jump into the campaign map to see what they have to work with. Now, as a reminder, all of the stuff that you're about to see and hear should be considered a work in progress. We have brought the mod to a point where we're willing to show off parts of it, but that doesn't mean that we're finished or this is set in stone. So, for example, we've rated them here as laughing at live dragons. We have not based this on any testing because we simply haven't gotten to that point in the development yet, but we do want this faction to be a fairly difficult experience. We don't want the elves to tromp over everything in the north of Middle-earth. But at any rate, Elrond the Wise remembers the lost glories and sorrows of the past, the kingdom of Gil-galad stretching from the Great Sea to the Misty Mountains, and the last alliance which saw Sauron cast down in his own Black Land. Of Gil-galad's realm only tatters remain. The High Elves of the West dwell in scattered enclaves, Círdan's folk in Lindon, Amroth in Lindorinand, and Elrond half-elven in the hidden refuge of Imladris, sundered from friends and allies by mountains, rivers, and hostile folk on all sides. The time for open war may be over. Still, the elves remember the valor of Isildur in his stand against the Dark Lord, and they have aided the last realm of the Dunedain in the north, Arthedain, against the evil that has arisen in Angmar. But though their warriors are unmatched, the firstborn begin to dwindle in these latter days. Beyond their borders, only wandering companies of elves may be found, undertaking pilgrimages to the sea or journeying on errantry. With Thranduil's people removed to the far north of Mirkwood, Lindorinand stands a solitary watch on the great river in the lands to the east. Shadows of war pass over the plain. Warlike folk gather in great numbers, poised to assault Gondor or to pursue fleeing Northmen up the Anduin. While Elrond's thought is turned to Angmar, will he save the north only to see the south fall into ruin? So a few things about this write-up. Again, this does harken back to an earlier stage in development where we viewed the Dunedain kingdom in the north as Arthedain, and if you've been following the channel, you know that we have changed the name to Arnor, just to better reflect the way the faction referred to themselves in at least a few exchanges, and the way they're referred to in the lore, at least at this point in history. But regardless, the other thing is that the general feel I think we want for this faction is, unsurpassed warriors, but difficulties maintaining population and recruitment, especially outside their home territory. We don't want to create a situation where you have these fantastic, Noldor units which are trainable everywhere on the map. We want to keep that somewhat restricted. And if you've played 4th Age Total War, all of us were working on that mod at various points, and so we've got a similar kind of philosophy for this High Elven faction. But ultimately, the point is that the elves are going to have a bit of a tricky time dealing with relatively low population growth, and restricted recruitment as to where they can get these fantastic units. And as we jump on the campaign map here to see how things look, just note that the High Elves are located really at the center of some of the most densely packed part of the map in terms of factions, just number of factions around them. They'll have to balance the fact that they will share a border with the Dunedain, very close border with the Black Forest tribes, maybe just a little bit, the Dwarves of Khazad-dûm, Durin's folk next to them, also the Newcomb Eotheod in the Anduin Vales, and then the Orcs and Angmar to their north. So a lot of stuff to keep track of. That doesn't even count the Wainriders, who will be just across the river, and Gondor, Chieftain of the Angren. Who knows how all this is going to play out. So we start with the elven capital of the High Elves at Imladris, and of course this is something you can change over the course of the campaign, but combined with that little write-up that we looked at earlier, it does give you the sense that Elrond is the sort of the master mover behind this faction, the faction leader, the lord of the High Elves, so to speak. He, of course, does play a pivotal role in events to follow, and so it seems to make sense to put this as the center. It's also fairly close to the actual center of the faction. Just to the south, of course, you've got the Lorien settlement, which actually comprises two different settlements. You've got Caras Galadon itself, and then to the southwest, we've got Limhir, a new elven settlement that is going to basically control the region of Parth Celebrant. A little bit farther away from where you may remember a settlement, I think right around here, Fairfeld, in 4th Age Total War, that served as sort of a block on these passages. But you'll notice the elven settlement here does not really contest the ford whatsoever. So it's going to be just interesting to see how the AI handles this. Are they going to defend any of these crossings, or is it going to be more of a hidden, sort of tucked away region? And the fact that you have settlements on the east as well as the west of the Misty Mountains means that the passes over the mountains are going to be very important for the High Elven faction, determining where and how and whether they're going to be able to reinforce those settlements. Imladris is kind of all alone by itself, and right at the start, it borders both Angmar to the north, as well as maybe just barely bordering the Orcish faction to the northeast. And this faction, the Orcs, are going to control what is essentially the High Pass. So this might make something of a good early target to try to acquire control of that passage. But remember, there is a pass right around here through the Misty Mountains north of Moria. So the control of that passage, which is only held by rebels initially, might be something that you want to make a priority, just so that you can ensure communication between these two parts of your settlements. And of course, in terms of those settlements, the High Elves use the new settlement map for elven factions, as you would expect, but they look really fantastic for the High Elves. It just looks totally perfect for these guys. Valor did a fantastic job setting these things up, and so it's really nice to see that, especially for settlements like Mithlond, like Imladris, where you could imagine that kind of grandiose construction. Now, Imladris is always a sort of an odd settlement to try to picture, right? Because in Tolkien's own art, his own paintings and depictions of Rivendell, it's really basically a house, right? But in the lore, it's described as being under siege, as providing troops. How are all these elves being armed and housed, and how exactly are they resisting sieges from Angmar or Sauron or whatever? So, of course, in the context of the game, we need to go with an actual settlement here to sort of represent that. And I imagine Rivendell is going to be the most active front. This is going to be the place where you'll be addressing both of the immediate foes right in your neighborhood, Angmar and the Orcs. And of course, this is the settlement, this is the region where you only have a single settlement to manage all of that. Now, that's why, again, I suggest opening up some of these passes is probably going to be a priority because you've got double the production capability in the Lorien region. And this area is probably not going to see as much action initially. Just across the river, we've got rebels in the Mirkwood Vales, and to the southeast, right around here, is where the Western Horde's territory is going to begin. So you may share a border with them initially, I can't quite remember, but regardless, even if you do, they're going to be busy with other things. There are going to be rebel settlements that they're trying to bring under control, and they're going to be at war with Gondor, of course, who will own territory down here. So you could remain aloof potentially for some time before the Wainriders become a concern. That could be a very good thing, assuming things play out that way, because you're, again, I think going to need to focus on the north early on. Of course, this is not your only territory, so let's sort of sweep over to the west through the region of Arnor to see what you have to work with here. So here we are with Mithlond, a very, very densely packed settlement, probably the largest, most populous settlement to begin the campaign as the High Elves. You've got, of course, a port, and this is probably where some economic benefit is going to come from as well. There's a few other settlements around here that you start with. You've got Forlindon and Harlindon to the north and south of the Gulf of Lune. And then to the north, you've got the Lune Valley, which in 4th Age Total War was a rebel region. This is going to be an elven region initially. Again, ignore that red face for now. We're going to be setting up the campaign initially so that your own homelands are not angry with you. So this is all work in progress stuff, but you will have a settlement up here. However, this may be a front in the war, although it's only sharing a border with rebels initially. There may be quick movements by Angmar to take this northern territory, and if so, to head down into the Lune Valley and threaten Mithlond. To your east, though, you will be shielded somewhat by the allies of Arnor, the Kingdom of Arnor here. And it is, in fact, Arnor who is going to start in possession of the White Towers. This is owned by the Kingdom of Arnor, even though they were built by the Elves. This is, of course, where one of the Palantir was kept, right? So, at any rate, you will have this sort of nice front here to your east, but of course, they're going to be under heavy pressure from Angmar and potentially the Orcs further to the east. So this is where you're going to have, 4 settlements, the highest concentration of landmass and territory. You'll have some depth here of defense. There will be no dwarven faction presence over here, although there will be some rebel regions, in the area. But for the most part, that means you own this territory, all of this, that you can see on the mini-map here, and will be relatively untroubled. To the south and east of the Lune regions, you will find the presence of some Mannish factions, what we're calling the Black Forest tribes, sort of a coastal faction and a woodland faction that is centered around Erenvorn, or at least that's where I'm imagining their power center is going to be. These people are described as being sort of afraid of the elves. They didn't want to cross the Brandywine River. But in the mod, they may grow because there's not a lot of other factions down here to prevent them from expanding. If they do expand, if Arnor gets really pushed by Angmar, then you may find this other group of men coming up into the north and contesting some of this territory. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out. But in the north, again, north of Arnor, there are some rebel settlements between you and Angmar initially. So playing for control of those is probably going to be, another important feature of the campaign. But it does remain to be seen exactly how long you'll have to play those kind of longer games when Angmar is pushing against Arnor. It's not all bleak, of course. You will have some neighbors that are mostly friendly. The faction of the Durin's folk to the west will own territory in Khazad-dûm, and you can probably expect to get some trading rights out of them if you work for it. Tough to see, though, what they're going to do ultimately, because this will be a faction that's probably not going to be passive on the campaign map, as you may remember the dwarves and elves being in 4th Age Total War. They may be expanding probably to the west initially, and maybe up north into the mountains maybe contesting with you to race for control of some of these new passes. So it may lead to some conflict between the High Elves and the Dwarves of Durin's folk. And further to the north, we've got the presence of the Eotheod right around here, I think, is where they start off. And so if they start expanding and pushing against the Orcs, against Angmar, that could, of course, be good, relieving some pressure, but that could also lead to a new rival in the area that you'll have to work with. Initially, though, just rebels to your north in the Gladden Vales, just rebels to your east in the Mirkwood Vales. But as you know, taking these rebel settlements is a way to sort of signal to the other AI factions that you mean business and you are someone that they may want to attack. Basically, the AI prefers to target rebels initially, in my experience at any rate. And so if you take away all the likely expansion, they may be turning on you at some point. So a war for the Anduin region may be coming. And if that does develop, it'll be interesting to see how and whether you will have any conflict with Thranduil, whose own territory, the Woodland Realm, is initially fairly far away, but again is only a couple settlements from your own starting position if you think of it. He's got 2 settlements over here, Thranduil does, and I think there's 1 or 2 settlements that separate you from him. So just a little bit of expansion could bring you right up against the Woodland Realm. And then what do you do, right? Then do you contest Thranduil for his territory? This is elven ground, of course. Do you sort of establish a new overlordship of these elves, or do you let them sort of live in peace? One of the questions people may have about the High Elves is how we're going to handle some of those important characters like Galadriel, Elrond, Círdan, Amroth, for example. There are some conflicting stories in the lore about how those things should be run, and how would we represent those characters in the game. So would these characters be generals on the campaign map? Would they be represented by ancillaries? Would they be represented by buildings, in a sense? And the answer is sort of all of the above. So I think what we'll do is we'll reveal all of that as those parts of the mod progress and get ironed out. But initially, we're definitely not going to have Galadriel as a captain, as a military leader. And in fact, probably not Círdan either. We're going to have some of these elves who simply didn't fight, at least in this time period, be represented more as buildings, more as passive presences on the campaign mat, so to speak. After all, it would be very strange if the players just stacked all of these godlike family members into a single army and then sent them off after the enemy. That really doesn't seem to be the way things worked out. There will be some, of course, some elves who are famous characters who will be generals. But for the most part, we're going to try to take a more restrained approach, I think, with how we present this. I think ultimately the High Elven campaign is going to be one initially of just trying to hang on long enough to build up and defend your very exposed capital, but then initially as the campaign progresses, probably sooner rather than later, trying desperately to protect your ally of Arnor. This kingdom has a lot of territory initially, and they may look like a nice, safe buffer for you, but it's unlikely that they're going to remain standing unless you can intervene to help. So that'll probably be some of the focus, either marching territory on their land to relieve the siege of a Numinas potentially, or moving your own armies up north to strike at Carn Dûm itself. We know very interestingly that I think it was around the 1400s of the Third Age, so a few centuries before the start date of this mod, but we do know that elves from Rivendell and I think Lorien had Angmar under siege for some unspecified amount of time. So it's certainly not unreasonable to imagine that you could attempt to recreate something similar. Heading north, beating back the Witch King and his hordes of orcs and evil men, and basically saving the day for the north. That said, we don't really know exactly how Arnor would have behaved had it survived with no rivals in the area. So while we're going to make sure that Arnor and the elves have a very good relationship initially, their presence will be something that you will need to manage somewhat. After all, their territory is territory that you might very much like to have for yourself. I think it's Gildor who tells Frodo in the Fellowship of the Ring that it was not always your shire, implying that maybe the elves once had this territory, as indeed they did. Gil-galad's kingdom stretched all the way to the Misty Mountains, and I believe even to the eaves of Mirkwood at some points. So you could look at this as all really, elvish territory theoretically. Everything from the mountains west to the sea, certainly north of the Grey Flood, could rightfully be yours. It will be up to you to see if you can enforce such grand schemes. But at any rate, I hope you've enjoyed this look at the High Elven faction for Total War Wainriders. Very nice detail in this settlement here. Of course, in future episodes, we're going to be looking at different factions. We're getting close to the point where we're going to run out of those factions. We still need to look at Arnor, do a preview for them, and we've got a handful of others. And after that, we're going to be looking at some other mechanics, other factors of the mod that we have been working on. Of course, if you want to take a look at the other previews, take a look through the channel. And until the next one, everybody, take care.